Hi, kids. This is Carol. In Kids Church, we've been learning about how God saved his people. And we've seen how God saved Moses. And now we're going to see how God uses Moses to save the rest of his people out of Egypt in Exodus 7 to 10. The Israelites are feeling trapped. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, has them as his slaves. They're working really hard all the time, making bricks for him. And so they cry out to God and say,
"It's a bit heavy. God help me."
and God heard them. And so he sent Moses and his brother Aaron to save them. Moses said to Pharaoh,
"Let my people go."
but Pharaoh said,
No.
see, Pharaoh, he wants to be the boss, and God warns him what's going to happen if he refuses to listen, but Pharaoh doesn't care. So Moses told Aaron to hold out his staff and strike the river Nile. And so God turned the river into blood. As the fish died, the smell was terrible. But still,
No, I won't let your people go.
Moses said to Pharaoh,
God says, "Let my people go."
but Pharaoh said,
No.
so Moses told Aaron to stretch out his staff, and God made loads of frogs come. Frogs were everywhere, and Pharaoh hated the frogs. So he said,
Just go.
but then he changed his mind and said,
You cannot go.
Moses said to Pharaoh,
Let my people go.
but Pharaoh said,
No.
so Moses told Aaron to stretch out his staff and hit the ground, and God made biting insects come. They were everywhere, and people were bitten. Still, Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. Moses said to Pharaoh,
Let my people go.
but Pharaoh said,
No, you cannot go.
God brought swarms of flies. They were everywhere. Pharaoh hated the flies, and he said,
Yeah.
but then he changed his mind and said,
No, go.
Moses said to Pharaoh,
God says, "Let my people go."
but Pharaoh said,
Work harder.
and God made all the animals that were out in the paddock get sick and die. There were horses, cows, and sheep. There were dead animals everywhere. But not where the Israelites lived. God didn't let any of their animals die. But Pharaoh still wouldn't let God's people go. Moses said to Pharaoh,
Let my people go.
but Pharaoh said,
No, you cannot go.
so Moses threw up dust in the air, and everyone was covered in sores. But still Pharaoh wouldn't let God's people go. Moses said to Pharaoh,
God says, "Let my people go."
but Pharaoh said,
No.
so Moses stretched out his staff, and then cold, hard balls of ice fell. Hail was everywhere. But hail didn't fall on God's people. Pharaoh hated the hail, and he said,
Go.
but then he changed his mind and said,
Stop.
Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. Moses said to Pharaoh,
God says, "Let my people go."
but Pharaoh said,
No, you cannot go.
so Moses stretched out his staff, and God made a wind blow all day and all night until there were locusts everywhere. They ate every green plant. But still Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. Moses said to Pharaoh,
Must go.
but Pharaoh said,
No, go.
so Moses stretched out his staff, and the land went dark. There was darkness for 3 days. It was dark everywhere except for where God's people lived. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. God had one more terrible plague, and after this, finally, Pharaoh let God's people go. And we'll learn about that next week. Well, the Israelites' enemies, they were the Egyptians. And God did all these things to save his people. But God has done something even more for us. Our enemy is not Pharaoh or the Egyptians, is it? Through Jesus, God has saved us from the power of sin, from Satan, and from death. We don't have to be afraid. God cares about us. God is powerful to save us. Trust Jesus. He can look after you.
Dear God, thank you for using your great power to rescue your people. Amen.